Welcome to episode number 70, Into the Rabbit Hole, Adult Anxiety Disorder. I'm your host, Damon Soka. If you've enjoyed these past episodes, I recommend that you send this one to a friend. Podcasting is most effective when done by word of mouth, especially a podcast as specific as this one is to its audience. Now today we're going to talk about the most common mental illness in society, and the one with which most individuals have some degree of experience. Understanding anxiety disorder and its specific origins in your life can make significant difference in your quality of life and experience with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Anxiety disorder is a unique mental illness. It is the one with which most adults, on a short-term basis, can identify and can understand in some form what it feels like and what it does to the brain. Now, I have never met anyone who has not experienced some kind of test anxiety, the sweaty palms and shaky body when asked to give a talk at church, or struggled to pass a driver's exam, or even the inevitable first date, even relationships in general. We all get nervous in our own way, meaning anxiety adapts itself to the person. Most often, the experiences with which we have least experience are the ones that cause us the greatest anxiety. Now, I realize that is an obvious statement. But when the brain encounters an unfamiliar experience with which it possesses little information and experience and is then required to act or perform in a public setting, now, by the way, when I say public setting, I can mean just one other person up to a large group, the brain itself has a tendency to go into a crisis mode, meaning that it ramps up the processes that heighten the senses and thought patterns in the body and brain, so it can actually be prepared for the experience. It will also go into information gathering mode, looking for any type of connections and information to reduce the amount of the unknown, thus reducing the amount of the anxiety. Interestingly enough, the brain will also slow down or even shut down other processes in the body to focus on the crisis. And sometimes, and many of you might be able to imagine this, sometimes that is even the thought process in the brain. Now, how many of us truly wanted to give that first public talk or perform that first piano solo or sing that first song when someone else was listening? The shaking, sweating, stammering, forgetting of lyrics or notes type of experience that really in the end leaves us exhausted and exhilarated all at once. Now, while for many it may not have been a drama, music, or talk or other similar type of performance, but anxiety will attach itself to any new type of event or performance we might have to make where we lack experience or information and the necessary feedback to do so. Now, anxiety is actually quite a normal human experience in life. It's actually part of the body's ability to defend itself against unknown attacks. However, when normal anxiety-driven processes, these normal processes extend beyond the anticipated length and intensity, and then beyond the ability to adequately cope with the body chemistry, what was once normal can actually evolve into a paralyzing and deafening experience to the body and mind, what we would call anxiety disorder. Now, while we all experience the emotion of anxiety, anxiety disorder goes far beyond a moment in time to affect important aspects of our mortal and spiritual lives. And today, that is our subject, the disorder of anxiety, the anxiety disorder, and what we can do to really help ourselves overcome. Now, anxiety disorders come in all shapes, intensities, and for differing reasons. And almost everyone has at least some mild form of the illness, whether it's snakes, spiders, heights, flying, new people, darkness, needles. We all have a strong aversion to something unknown in our lives, and we will go out of our way to avoid particular events, people, places, animals, plants, darkness, relationships, dentists. You can name hundreds. Phobias come naturally, they come genetically, they come learned, and they can come by traumatic events. They can actually be short-term. Even an anxiety disorder can be short-term or it can last a lifetime. And symptoms can increase with time or eventually decrease through therapy and treatment. The symptoms affect almost well, they can affect almost any part of our life and cause us to avoid situations, people, and really almost anything that interacts with our brain. Now, while these phobias and anxieties are a part of the overall anxiety spectrum, we generally don't do anything with them unless they really affect our life and our ability to function socially within the community. Surprisingly, even phobias regarding social situations are often ignored, as long as the actual phobia does not fully invade our social abilities. Many people learn to live with moderate social anxiety disorder through coping mechanisms they have developed over time by experience. Now, we develop coping mechanisms naturally and by learning from those around us. Now, while our efforts do not always produce the most effective coping mechanisms, if they are deemed sufficient by our society and ourselves, we generally do not work to treat them. Some people may seem a little socially awkward or socially adverse, and actually many of these issues are the result of a serious anxiety. Most people, however, do not consider the awkwardness or aversion as a moderate anxiety disorder or even a social anxiety disorder. But the truth is that many anxiety disorders tend to be ignored, coped with, and placed in a box rather than treated. It is a function of the newness of the science and really the oldness of traditions. When you consider the difference between moderate anxiety and serious disorder, there are some blurred lines about what types of anxiety and symptoms need help and those that perhaps may not. So with anxiety, as with all mental illness, we really look to the symptoms to determine if the illness classifies as moderate or severe or even mild, and the impact that it has on our lives and whether it should be treated. Surprisingly, most anxiety disorders are not treated, even when that treatment is warranted and needed for the overall mental and physical health of the person. Many who suffer could actually use some coaching or brain training on how best to deal with anxious situations. Most of the time, we rely on friends and family who have experienced it or our own painful learning experiences as how to best cope with difficult and anxious moments. The truth is, the main coping mechanism in use for almost everyone is avoidance. If it gives us serious anxiety, we tend to avoid it. This is actually one of the ways the brain uses to avoid dealing with those unknown moments and experiences. Now, to answer when you should seek help is dependent upon a few questions and, of course, your honest answers. First of all, what are your symptoms? How long do those symptoms last? And most important, what are they affecting in your life and for how long? Now, symptoms. We often think of anxiety symptoms as the sweaty palms, the racing heart, accelerating thoughts, sometimes confusion, a paralyzing fear of something, someone, or someplace. But it also can include restlessness or tension, a sense of impending danger, insomnia, gastrointestinal problems, headaches, and what can be called avoidance. Avoidance is actually a good sign that you have an anxiety disorder. Now, it is important to note that most people feel some of these symptoms for brief periods of time based on the levels of stress they are experiencing in life events. For instance, if you are planning a wedding 6 months in advance, I would think that you might feel a little anxious during most of that time period. But it really doesn't classify as anxiety disorder unless that anxiety becomes paralyzing and begins to affect really normal everyday activities, and of course the wedding. So you have to address what you are avoiding and the symptoms that are affecting your everyday life, including eating, sleep, work, recreation, relationships, and really your entire day. Now, I think it important to address all types of anxiety myself, but those anxieties we'll discuss today will be of the nature that it is affecting your everyday activities and life events in a moderate to serious way. As a baseline, most doctors talk about a 6-month duration with major anxiety during at least the majority of the days or the period of time. Now, as we've discussed, the wedding event, you would expect some anxiety. The level that it affects you and what you do, where you go, and your daily cycle of eating, sleeping, working, recreation, relationships, and so forth is really the question you need to honestly answer. Now, you're going to have to remember that most people who experience mental illness cannot see the forest through the trees. meaning that when you are in the middle of the fray, it can be almost impossible to step back and objectively look at your life. You are likely going to have to listen to friends and family to best understand how anxiety is truly affecting your life. There is one important note I would like to make about anxiety disorders. There is no one set of parameters that will tell you that you're going to develop an anxiety disorder. One can develop serious anxiety well after teenage and early adulthood. It is true that many cases developed are linked to those early years when we are learning about life and experiencing most of our unknowns. But that does not preclude developing serious anxiety symptoms where none had ever existed well into your 40s, 50s, or 60s. Most of the time, the disorder just needs the right conditions, such as a traumatic event, a remembrance of a traumatic event, serious life change, such as cancer, or a loss of income, loss of relationships, such as divorce or death, and it can even be much smaller events. Now, even one of those conditions, unfortunately, is the isolation and fear surrounding pandemics. Isolation, fear of the contagion, death, and consistent negative reporting all can lead to moderate to severe cases of the illness. Now, generally, one will also have to have precursors for an event like the pandemic to create a full-blown anxiety disorder, meaning you will have had to have some anxiety in the past. But there are people who have developed a moderate condition during this pandemic without ever having experienced a serious episode. If you do not remember anything today about this podcast, I want you to remember this. Anxiety disorder can happen to anyone at any time, and there should never be a fault or blame, meaning that the idea that you have somehow brought about this chemical reaction in your body by your own thoughts or actions is really entirely false, and is really false and not really entirely true. These disorders are simply part of the processing system of the brain that really can take over and leave you speechless and helpless without really much warning. They are part of that fight or flight programming in the brain, and they are really intended to keep you from harm. Now, do not think for an instant that you're weak or broken or sinful in any sense of the word. You're dealing with one of the most powerful chemical systems in your body. And when it's unleashed, it can cause havoc and chaos in the brain and body. Now, like all other mental illnesses, anxiety changes reality for the person who is affected. It will change if and when and where they go, how they get there, what time they show up. Anxiety does not have to begin with a thought or even a negative comment or experience. Anxiety disorder can cause the individual to race from problem to problem and thought to thought based on brain chemistry alone. In other words, the emotional body chemistry begins to drive the brain. Anxiety can and is often associated with traumatic events such as abuse, accidents, and other trauma. And it does show up in individuals who experienced the trauma and those who witnessed the traumatic events. Now, no matter how anxiety starts, it is very much like the metaphor from Alice in Wonderland. You begin to chase the rabbit down its hole. In the book, Alice chases the white rabbit down its hole and finds herself in a new reality. That reality was never her intended location, but Alice ends up there simply chasing the rabbit. Something similar happens to those with anxiety disorders and the feelings. As they chase those feelings, as those feelings of anxiousness drive them to places they never intended to go and where they can really become locked into their own inner world. Now, that world can be frightening and exhausting. And many times I've heard individuals say that they just can't stop thinking about it. They review that scenario over and over again, which only increases their anxiety and negative reinforcement. Now, phobias or serious anxieties that do not fade with time and insufficient coping mechanisms are going to need a more professional approach. Anxieties can really cause serious health conditions or social inabilities, or even lead to other mental illnesses such as major depressive disorder or PTSD, known as post-traumatic stress disorder. Anxiety can be a springboard for all sorts of other difficulties, such as sleep disorders, eating disorders, substance abuse, intestinal and digestive problems, headaches, ADD, and a host of other concerns. Now, most individuals who have a separate mental illness, such as bipolar, as I did, often have associative anxiety with that illness. Anxiety may not even be the cause of the other mental illness, but actually a symptom of it, which it was in my case. It is important to understand that just because an individual has been able to develop effective coping mechanisms does not mean that they will not eventually encounter something that will push them into the category of needing help. What I'm trying to say is we can all go down the rabbit hole and chase the rabbit of anxiety only to realize that we've come to a place we never expected and a reality we never intended. Now, I will admit my past life has been rocked by anxiety on more than one occasion, and I still deal with it, but probably more in very mild ways than I used to. And one of my coping mechanisms, by the way, which drives my wife crazy, is to schedule and plan everything and to plan for every eventuality and even the crazy possibilities, and then to review those plans over and over again. Now, in the past, change has been a major trigger for my anxiety. Now, my mother tells a story that when I was younger, that I had to know exactly where we were going when we went into town. I lived out in the country. I had to know the order that we were going to stop and the pathway, and often almost exactly how long it was going to be. So yes, I did have serious anxiety as a child, and as a teenager, and up until my early 40s. I've lived with anxiety so long that sometimes I have difficulty living without it. I still feel like I'm missing something or something isn't right on a regular basis. By the way, which is a symptom of anxiety. My hyper-focus on planning and feeling I need to plan excessively and rehearse those plans is a coping mechanism, and that is also a sign of serious anxiety disorder. Now, I was never treated for it and early in my life, one, because it is a relatively new study of science, and of course, I was dealing with a more difficult bipolar disorder. Again, not uncommon for both to exist at the same time. In fact, I would think that it is probably more rare not to have anxiety with other mental illnesses. In any case, my coping mechanisms, as good as they were, did not fully compensate for my difficulties. And so I suffered a great deal of anxiousness, no matter how much I planned or what I did to cope. I honestly didn't enjoy social events, simply because people were and are unpredictable, and I couldn't effectively use my planning methods to cope with the stress. Now, I worried about everything and anything, and anyone who knew me, probably during my teenage and early young adult years, probably could have easily seen my problems. The main problem with those who suffer serious bouts and even moderate bouts of the illness is that life is not predictable. Sure, I could get a few things right in my planning, but no one can plan for everything. And when my plans didn't cover some of the unpredictable events, my anxiety would boil over, and it caused irritation, confusion, and emotional distress. Now, I would have to say that I don't remember a time in my early life, even until my late 30s, when I could say that I wasn't anxious almost every day. I rarely felt peaceful, content, and sure of my life in really any respect. Now, I do very well now and have little to no anxiety in my life, and I cope far better with it than I ever have. But it has taken years and decades to get to this point in my life, and what I did and how I came to the point I did is probably for a full nother episode that will likely follow this one. Now, living with serious anxiety and the gospel, in theory, should not increase the intensity of anxiety symptoms. The gospel, after all, speaks of peace, love, mercy, and understanding. The gospel even speaks of this life as a learning experience, where we are sent to work through concerns and issues, and that we can expect our Father to fully understand our situation in life and the difficulties we face. Now, given the wider picture of the gospel, it should be the very place we should be able to go to calm our fears and reduce our anxieties. And that is true from the overall perspective. The Savior himself states that he gives us these types of weaknesses that we might come to him and then obtain the strength to overcome. However, for almost everyone who suffers, the church as a functioning society can and often does present serious difficulties that intensify symptoms and exacerbate underlying causes of the anxiety. Now, there exist at least three major problems within the church culture that actually can cause serious issues with people who have anxiety disorders. Now, the first is what I'll call self-doubt, self-worth, and a learning process. Now, when considering the problems associated with those symptoms of anxiety disorder, understand that those who suffer deal with serious problems of self-doubt and self-worth, and they are rarely at peace. They already have intensified their weaknesses in their own minds and fully know where they lack in their spiritual nature, and probably have added a few things beyond that. More often than not, people who suffer simply need to feel mercy and love for who they are, rather than a heavy hand or a condescending ideal of where they should be in their spiritual, social, and psychological development. It is best to leave them to their own pace of development to help them help themselves by being loving, encouraging, merciful. They are going to have great difficulties feeling peace and love, really the Spirit of the Lord, due to the consistent doubt, fear, and general anxiousness they face. Now, I personally rarely remember feeling at peace most of my life. Now, I certainly had felt the Spirit, but I did not feel it like other people. My feelings came differently because really they had to. And even then, I struggled to reconcile those anxious feelings with those I felt by the Spirit. And often spiritual feelings did not last long because they became overcome through the doubt and the anxiousness that I had. I will admit that my testimony was based more in the doctrine and enlightenment feelings I had come to understand intellectually, as that was the best way for the Lord to speak to me due to my anxiety and bipolar. I often struggled with how to go about serving and living the gospel, as there were so many thoughts, doubts, and emotions overwhelming my system. I didn't know where to begin or what to believe at times. Now, I've always believed in my later years that the Lord knew this, and I can see that He provided a wide measure of mercy to those things He asked me to do, understanding that I really had what would be termed a spiritual learning disability, caused by a very mortal physical problem. Now, I think that for those who suffer within the church, this is an important message. They need to understand that their physical, emotional illness can and does cause some spiritual disabilities to occur, especially in socially active and peer-inspired group of action-oriented religious people as we are in the church. Now, the second problem is that the church society, by its nature and traditions, places individuals who suffer in all types of anxiety-inducing situations. Now, giving talks, giving prayers out loud, reading scriptures in public, presenting yourself as a faithful member, being a teacher, being a leader, ministering, and I could probably go on with a host of other social activities and situations, each creating serious complications for one who suffers from anxiety disorder. Beyond these situations, often church members are inclined to the tradition that all anxiety can be and is overcome by just going forth and doing whatever causes you the anxiety. Now, which for anxiety sufferers can actually be quite the opposite. Now, I don't blame church members for these traditions of the pioneers in the American society. For 80% of the people out there, to go forth and do is probably the solution to anxiety and all that comes with it, given that they will eventually create the necessary coping mechanisms. But it can be very damaging to one who suffers anxiety disorder to hear the "just do it" slogan, as they will become overcome with paralysis. Now, don't get me wrong, even major therapy treatments advocate for kind of a go forth and do method to overcome anxiety, but there are unique ways to go about it when serious anxiety disorder is the problem. And often this involves far more incremental steps and building upon successes, and oftentimes even involves medications. To treat serious anxiety disorder head-on as a go-and-do problem can cause far more harm than good and lead to individuals actually leaving the church, not because of a testimony problem, but because of feelings of anxiousness and fear that come to them with that method of treatment and also with all of those anxiety-inducing situations. Now, third, and this is important, battles of chemistry, emotion, mind, and body are still, by their nature, subjected to a mind over matter, spirit over body tradition in the church. We have a long tradition in the church that the body needs to be brought under control by the spirit, meaning we should not let our bodies, appetites, emotions, thoughts overcome our spiritual desires and spiritual control of our bodies. However, we leave little room for mental illness when we talk of this principle. When we do not leave room for those who suffer with mental illness, those who suffer can be left to feel as though they will never belong. That in many ways they are weak and unworthy of the gospel because they can't bring their emotional or mental state under control without therapy and medication. They feel the burden of this underlying tradition as a sign that they don't belong. Now, I know that the tradition was never meant to cause harm to those who suffer, but I can tell you that it is such a dominant underlying tradition and principle that it seems to permeate every subject in the gospel. I know the Lord fully understands anxiety disorder at its very core, and I don't believe that he faults anyone for doing their best and trying to learn the lessons of the gospel. I believe wholeheartedly that when anxiety interrupts our mental capacity and physical abilities, that the Lord knows and understands and provides for the grace and mercy necessary. The Lord certainly wants anyone who suffers to take full advantage of the science he has provided through research and study and to work with the illness as best they can. But to think that the Lord requires one who suffers with anxiety disorder to fully participate in the gospel as one who does not have anxiety disorder is simply incorrect in principle and theory. The Lord gives us these weaknesses to teach us profound principles of the body and mind, and to help us develop stronger capacities while working through our difficulties. He does provide the necessary grace where weakness in the body and mind have diminished our capacities to govern our minds and bodies. Now, I do not say that this is an excuse to commit sin. There is no excuse to commit sin. But it does provide for those moments when mental illness has made it impossible to go forth and do. And this includes full-time missionary service, ministering, leadership callings, and really everything that the Lord would have us accomplish and do for others. We are to run the race at the pace the Lord has given, and not compare our disabled marathon to another's marathon who is much longer, but who has been given a greater capacity. So what is the takeaway for today? First, foremost, those who suffer are going to feel weak when our illness comes upon us and causes us diminished capacity. We're going to feel inadequate, useless, unworthy, dumb, and even stupid at times. And I have felt all those things many times. We are going to face the headwinds of those who do not understand, and really those who do not want to understand the nature of mental illness and anxiety disorder. We're probably going to have to come to terms with the go and do culture, and the go and do, and probably go and do what we can, even when that might not be very much at all. We're going to have to come to terms with the illness that the Lord fully understands what he has given us in this life. We might have to accept that some people will never see us as we truly are without our illness. We are likely going to need medication, therapy, or the brain trainers, and other scientific help, and it's going to make us feel dependent, weak, and incapable. I have taken medication most of my life. But the one thing I know and can assure anyone is that the Lord fully understands and knows you and your weakness, and he would not have given it to you if it was not for a wise and incredibly important purpose in your life and the life of those around you. And he has not impeded your opportunity for celestial life. I can tell you that when the illness is removed, your capacity will be far greater than it ever would have been had you been given what we might call a normal life. Now, while I admit to wishing for a normal life on more than one occasion, I do take heart in knowing that the Lord can work with what I have, no matter how small, and then he can really take up the rest of the matter for himself. Now, may the Lord continue to bless you in your weakness, and we'll talk to you next week.